The gunshot that killed Sarah Jenkins on their wedding day in 1872 wasn't meant for her, but Asher Whitmore carried the weight of it like a millstone around his neck anyway. 3 years had passed since that terrible morning in Cheyenne, when a stray bullet from a saloon brawl shattered the stained glass window of the church and found Sarah standing in her white dress, bouquet trembling in her hands as she waited for him at the altar. Asher had been adjusting his collar in the side room when he heard the crack of gunfire, followed by screams that would echo in his nightmares for years to come. By the time he burst through the door, Sarah was already gone, her blood pooling on the wooden floorboards while the preacher knelt beside her, praying words that felt hollow and useless. The men responsible had been caught and hanged within a week, but it brought Asher no comfort. He sold everything he owned in Cheyenne and drifted west, eventually settling in South Pass City, Wyoming in the spring of 1873. The mining town suited his dark mood perfectly with its harsh winds, rocky terrain, and the kind of people who knew better than to ask a man about his past. He bought a small ranch on the outskirts where he raised horses and kept to himself, building walls around his heart that he swore no woman would ever breach again. The men at the Lucky Dollar Saloon had learned not to introduce him to their sisters or daughters. The widows at church stopped bringing him pies and casseroles after the first year of polite but firm rejections. Even Pretty Me, who ran the saloon and had soft eyes for lonely cowboys, had given up trying to coax a smile from him. Asher Whitmore had become as much a fixture of South Pass City as the mountains themselves, solid and unmovable and alone. He was breaking a particularly stubborn mare on a bright October morning in 1875, when he first saw the stagecoach struggling up the mountain road. The driver was whipping the horses harder than necessary, and even from a distance, Asher could see the way the coach listed to one side, likely a damaged wheel. He watched with detached interest as the coach lurched to a stop about a quarter-mile from his property, near where the road bent sharply around a rocky outcrop. Asher returned his attention to the mare, running his calloused hands along her neck and speaking in low, soothing tones. He had no intention of involving himself in whatever trouble had befallen the stagecoach. There was a relay station another mile up the road where they could get help. But then he heard it, carried on the wind, a woman's voice calling out in frustration, and despite every promise he had made to himself, despite the armor he had so carefully constructed, something in that voice made him pause. He told himself he was just being neighborly as he saddled his stallion and rode toward the disabled coach. It was what anyone would do. It meant nothing. But when he rounded the outcrop and saw her standing there in the dust, hands on her hips, dark hair escaping from pins that had long ago lost their battle with the rough journey, he felt something crack inside his chest that he thought had been permanently sealed. She was arguing with the driver, a grizzled man named Pete who Asher knew from town. "I do not care if it takes all day," she was saying, her voice carrying that particular tone of educated Eastern refinement that immediately marked her as an outsider. "I paid for passage to South Pass City, and I intend to arrive in South Pass City, not stranded on some God-forsaken mountainside. Lady, I am telling you the axle is cracked clean through," Pete said, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool autumn air. "We ain't going nowhere until I can get it fixed proper." "Then fix it," she said simply. "With what tools? Magic and prayer?" Asher cleared his throat and both of them turned to look at him. Pete's face broke into a relieved grin. "Whitmore, thank the Lord. Maybe you can talk some sense into this woman." But Asher was not looking at Pete. He was looking at her, at the way the sun caught the amber flecks in her brown eyes, at the smudge of dirt on her cheek, at the stubborn set of her jaw that reminded him so painfully of Sarah that for a moment he could not breathe. And yet she was nothing like Sarah. Where Sarah had been soft and blonde and gentle as a spring rain, this woman looked like she could face down a thunderstorm and come out victorious. "Miss," he said, tipping his hat and hating how rough his voice sounded from disuse in polite conversation. "Asher Whitmore. I have a ranch just over that ridge. I can take you into town while Pete here works on the coach." Her eyes narrowed slightly, assessing him with an intelligence that made him want to simultaneously look away and step closer. "And my trunk. I will bring Pete tools from my workshop and come back for your trunk once he has the coach roadworthy again. Or I can have it brought to town for you tomorrow." She considered this for a long moment, and Asher found himself waiting for her answer with an anticipation that annoyed him. He should not care whether she accepted his help or not. He should ride away and leave her to Pete and her stubbornness, and those eyes that seemed to see straight through him. "Very well," she said finally, and offered him her hand in a gesture that was more masculine than feminine, a handshake rather than a delicate finger touch. "Thea Morrison. Most people call me Thea." Her hand was smaller than his, but her grip was firm, and Asher felt calluses on her palm that spoke of work, real work, not the soft hands of a lady who had never done anything more strenuous than embroidery. "Miss Morrison," he acknowledged, releasing her hand perhaps a moment too quickly. "My horse can carry us both. It is not far." She looked at his stallion with an expression that might have been appreciation. "He is beautiful. What is his name?" "Smoke," Asher said, and he helped her up into the saddle before mounting behind her, his arms coming around her to grasp the reins. He tried to ignore how aware he was of her presence, the faint scent of lavender that clung to her despite the dust of travel, the way she held herself straight and proper, even though she must have been exhausted from hours in the stage coach. They rode in silence for several minutes, Smoke picking his way carefully along the rocky trail. Finally, Thea spoke. "You are wondering what brings an Eastern woman to Wyoming." "Not my business," Asher said, though he had been wondering exactly that. "I am a teacher," she said. "The school board in South Pass City sent for me 6 weeks ago. Apparently, their previous teacher married a minor and moved to California. We have not had a proper teacher in near about 8 months, Asher confirmed. The children have been making do with whatever their parents can teach them. "Then I arrived just in time," Thea said, and there was something in her voice, a determination that made Asher think she was running towards something as much as he had been running away. When they reached his ranch, Asher helped her down from the horse and tried not to notice the way she looked around his property with frank curiosity. The ranch was not much, a small house he had built himself, a barn, several corrals, and the mountains rising behind it all like sentinels. He knew it was rough and spare, a bachelor's dwelling with none of the touches a woman might add, but he had never cared before. "I will get those tools for Pete," he said. "You can wait inside if you like. There is water in the pitcher and some bread if you are hungry." "Thank you," Thea said, but she did not move toward the house. Instead, she walked to the nearest corral where 3 horses watched her with interest. She held out her hand, letting the closest one, a gray mare named Silver, sniff her palm. "You know horses," Asher observed, pausing on his way to the barn. "My father bred them," Thea said simply, "before he died." There was a weight to those last 3 words that Asher recognized because he carried the same weight himself. He wanted to ask her more, wanted to know her story, but he had no right to her past when he guarded his own so jealously. So instead, he just nodded and went to gather the tools. By the time he returned from helping Pete, the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Thea was sitting on his porch steps, looking out at the view with an expression of such longing that Asher almost turned around and left her to her private moment. But Silver had already announced his presence with a soft whinny, and Thea turned to look at him. "Pete says it will be tomorrow afternoon before he can get the coach moving again," Asher said. "The relay station is about 2 miles north if you want to stay there tonight, or I can take you into town now and you can find lodging at the boarding house." "How far is town?" "About an hour's ride." Thea looked up at the darkening sky. "Is there a third option?" Asher knew what she was asking, and every instinct told him to say no, to maintain the distance he had worked so hard to create, to not let this woman with her intelligent eyes and calloused hands any closer than she already was. But his mother had raised him to be a gentleman, and Sarah would have been ashamed of him for even considering leaving a woman stranded. "You can stay here," he heard himself say. "I have a spare room. It is not much, but it is clean. I do not want to impose." "You already are," Asher said, and then immediately regretted the harshness of his words. But Thea just laughed, a sound like water over stones, clear and unexpected. "Fair enough," she said. "Then I accept your hospitality, Mr. Whitmore, and I will try to impose as little as possible." Asher made dinner. Simple fare of beans and salt pork and the bread she had seen earlier, and they ate in a silence that was somehow more comfortable than awkward. Thea did not press him with questions or try to fill the quiet with unnecessary chatter. She simply ate and watched the sunset through his window and seemed content with her own thoughts. After dinner, Asher showed her to the spare room, which had once been intended as a nursery in a future that would never come to pass. It held only a bed and a small dresser now, the walls bare, but Thea looked at it like it was a palace. "Thank you," she said softly, "for your kindness today." "It is nothing," Asher said, backing toward the door because the room suddenly felt too small with both of them in it. "It is not nothing," Thea said, and her eyes met his with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Kindness is never nothing." Asher lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling of his bedroom and trying to ignore the fact that there was a woman sleeping just on the other side of his wall. He had not had a woman in his house since Sarah died. Had not wanted one. Had convinced himself that he was content with his solitude and his horses and his carefully maintained distance from anything that might require him to feel again. But Thea Morrison had walked into his life with dirt on her cheek and determination in her voice, and he could feel the walls he had built beginning to crack. The next morning, Asher woke before dawn, as was his habit, and found Thea already in his kitchen, attempting to work his cantankerous stove. She looked up when he entered, her hair braided over one shoulder, still wearing the same traveling dress from yesterday. "I was trying to make coffee," she said, gesturing at the stove. "But I think your stove has declared war on me." "It takes a certain touch," Asher said, and he moved to help her, showing her where to adjust the flue and how to coax the flames just right. They stood close together in the small kitchen, and Asher was aware of every breath she took, every small movement of her hands. "There," he said when the coffee finally began to percolate, "it just takes patience." "I am not known for my patience," Thea admitted. "My mother used to say I had the temperament of a racehorse, always wanting to run before I learned to walk." "What happened to her?" Asher asked. "Your mother." "The same thing that happened to my father," Thea said, her voice going quiet. "Influenza, 2 years ago. They died within a week of each other. My brother got the house and the stables. I got enough money for train fare west and the assurance that I was free to make my own way in the world." "I am sorry," Asher said, and he meant it. "So am I," Thea said. "But grief is a luxury I cannot afford. I have a new life to build here." Asher understood that sentiment better than she could know. He poured them both coffee, and they drank it on the porch while the sun rose over the mountains, turning the autumn grass to gold. They did not talk much, but the silence between them felt different now, charged with something Asher was not ready to name. He took her into town after breakfast, riding Smoke with Thea seated in front of him this time so she could see the trail. She asked questions about the town, about the school, about the families whose children she would be teaching. Asher found himself answering more than he intended, drawn out by her genuine interest, and the way she listened like every word mattered. South Pass City sprawled across the mountainside in a haphazard collection of buildings that had grown up around the gold mines. The main street was wide and dusty, lined with the saloon, the general store, the assay office, the church, and various other establishments that served the miners and ranchers who called this harsh land home. The schoolhouse sat at the far end of town, a simple wooden structure that looked like it had seen better days. "It is not much," Asher said as he helped Thea down from the horse in front of the building. "It is perfect," Thea said, and she meant it. She walked up the steps and pushed open the door, disappearing inside with the eagerness of a child on Christmas morning. Asher tied Smoke to the rail and followed her inside, watching as she moved through the single room, taking inventory of the desks, the chalkboard, the pot-bellied stove in the corner. Her face was alight with a joy that was almost painful to witness. "When do you start?" he asked. "Tomorrow, if the school board approves me," Thea said. "I am supposed to meet with them this afternoon at the church." "They will approve you," Asher said with certainty. "They are desperate for a teacher." "You make me sound like a last resort," Thea said, but she was smiling. "I just mean," Asher started, but she cut him off with a laugh. "I know what you mean, and you are right, but I do not mind being a last resort if it means I get to teach." The door opened behind them, and Asher turned to see Reverend Samuel Marsh entering with two other men, members of the school board. The Reverend's eyes widened slightly when he saw Asher, and Asher knew what he was thinking. In 3 years, Asher had attended church exactly twice, both times for funerals. His presence here with a woman would be the talk of the town by supper time. "Miss Morrison, I presume?" Reverend Marsh said, recovering his composure and extending his hand to Thea. "Yes, Reverend," Thea said, shaking his hand firmly. "I apologize for not calling on you immediately upon my arrival, but there was some trouble with the stagecoach." "So we heard," the Reverend said. "Pete sent word this morning. We are grateful to Mr. Whitmore for assisting you." The meeting was brief and businesslike. The school board asked Thea about her qualifications, her teaching philosophy, her willingness to commit to at least 1 year in South Pass City. She answered each question with confidence and intelligence, and Asher found himself impressed, despite having no reason to doubt her capabilities. "Well, Miss Morrison," Reverend Marsh said finally, "I think we can safely say that the position is yours if you want it. Classes begin tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. We have arranged lodging for you at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. She runs a respectable establishment and has a room available." "Thank you, Reverend," Thea said. "I look forward to meeting my students." Asher walked with her to the boarding house, carrying the small bag she had brought with her from the stagecoach. Mrs. Henderson, a bustling woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, welcomed Thea warmly and showed her to a small but comfortable room on the 2nd floor. "I will have your trunk brought over tomorrow when Pete gets the coach fixed," Asher said, standing in the doorway because he knew if he stepped inside he would not want to leave. "Thank you," Thea said. "For everything. I know I said it before, but I mean it. You have been very kind to a stranger." "Welcome to South Pass City," Miss Morrison, Asher said, and then he left before he could do something foolish like ask when he could see her again. But South Pass City was a small town, and Asher found that avoiding Thea Morrison was easier said than done. He saw her at the general store 3 days later, buying supplies for the schoolhouse. He saw her at church on Sunday, where she sat in the front row and sang hymns in a clear soprano that made his chest ache. He saw her walking through town with some of her students, pointing out plants and rocks and teaching them even outside the confines of the classroom. Each time their eyes met, Asher felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Each time, he reminded himself of the promises he had made, the walls he had built, the pain that came from loving and losing. Each time he walked away. But Thea Morrison was not a woman easily ignored. A month after her arrival, she appeared at his ranch on a Saturday morning, riding a rented horse from the livery and looking determined. "Miss Morrison," Asher said, setting down the fence post he had been repairing, "is something wrong?" "That depends on your perspective," Thea said, dismounting with practiced ease. "I need your help." "With what?" "Teaching," she said. "Several of my older students work in the mines or on ranches during the week and cannot attend regular classes. I want to hold special lessons on Saturday afternoons for anyone who wants to learn, adults included. But I do not know enough about this land to teach them properly. I need someone who understands Wyoming, who can teach them about the animals and the weather and how to survive here." "I am not a teacher," Asher said. "No, but you are a survivor," Thea said. "And that is what these people need to learn, not just reading and arithmetic, but how to truly live in this place." Asher wanted to say no, should have said no. But Thea was looking at him with those eyes that seemed to see past all his defenses, and he found himself agreeing before his brain caught up with his mouth. "Fine," he said. "Saturday afternoons. 2 hours." "Thank you," Thea said, and her smile was brighter than the Wyoming sun. The Saturday lessons became a fixture in Asher's life. He taught rough miners and weathered ranchers and young boys barely old enough to shave about tracking and hunting and reading the sky for weather. Thea taught them to read and write and do figures, skills that could mean the difference between success and failure in this unforgiving land. They made a good team, complementing each other's strengths, and Asher found himself looking forward to those Saturday afternoons with an anticipation that both thrilled and terrified him. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a vengeance that reminded everyone why Wyoming was not for the faint of heart. The schoolhouse was drafty and cold, and Asher found himself stopping by with extra firewood, with supplies for the stove, with any excuse he could invent to see Thea and make sure she was managing. "You do not have to keep checking on me," Thea said one particularly brutal afternoon in December when Asher arrived with his 4th load of firewood that week. "I am quite capable of taking care of myself." "I know that," Asher said, stacking the wood neatly against the wall. "But that does not mean you should have to." Thea studied him for a long moment, and Asher had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through him, could see all the things he was trying so hard to keep hidden. "Why do you do this?" she asked finally. "Help me, I mean. You go out of your way to avoid everyone else in this town, but you are always here when I need something." "Someone has to make sure you do not freeze to death," Asher said, deflecting. "It would reflect poorly on South Pass City if we let our only teacher turn into an icicle." "Asher," Thea said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. It sounded different in her voice, softer somehow. "Talk to me, please." And maybe it was the cold, or the way the winter light fell through the schoolhouse windows, or the fact that he was so tired of carrying his grief alone, but Asher found himself talking. He told her about Sarah, about the wedding day that had ended in blood and screaming, about the guilt that ate at him like a cancer. He told her about the promises he had made to himself, about the walls he had built, about the certainty that he would never love again because the cost was too high. Thea listened without interrupting, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Love is not a promise you can make or break, Asher. It is not something you can control or prevent, it just is." "That is what terrifies me," Asher admitted. "It terrifies me too," Thea said softly. "After my parents died, I swore I would never need anyone again. I would be independent and self-sufficient and completely in control of my own life. But then I came here, and I met you, and I realized that needing someone is not the same as being weak." Asher's heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. "Thea, I am not asking you to," Thea interrupted. "I am just telling you that I understand. I understand being afraid. I understand building walls, but I am also telling you that I think we are both tired of being alone." She was right. God help him, she was right. Asher was so tired of the loneliness, of the empty house and the silent dinners and the nights when the grief sat on his chest like a physical weight. He was tired of denying the thing that had been growing between him and Thea since the moment he had helped her off that stagecoach. "I do not know if I can do this," he said honestly. "Neither do I," Thea said, "but maybe we can figure it out together." Asher closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, and when he kissed her, it felt like breaking the surface of water after being submerged too long. Thea's arms came around his neck, and she kissed him back with a fierceness that matched his own, all the weeks of tension and denial combusting into something that felt like coming home and setting sail at the same time. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Asher rested his forehead against hers. "I am still afraid," he whispered. "So am I," Thea whispered back. "But I am more afraid of not trying." They courted through the rest of that hard winter, though courting seemed too gentle a word for what they had. It was not flowers and poetry and polite afternoon calls. It was Asher teaching Thea to shoot, so she could protect herself on the walk home from school. It was Thea reading to him in the evenings by his fireplace, everything from Shakespeare to dime novels. It was learning to trust again, to open up again, to believe that maybe happiness was not a betrayal of the people they had lost. The town watched their relationship develop with interest and approval. Pretty Me told Asher he looked 5 years younger when he smiled. Reverend Marsh preached a sermon about new beginnings that was so obviously directed at them that Thea had to hide her laughter behind her hymnal. Mrs. Henderson started leaving them alone in the boarding house parlor with only the barest pretense of chaperoning. Spring came late but glorious, the mountains shedding their snow like old skin and revealing the green beneath. Asher took Thea riding through the high meadows where wildflowers bloomed in impossible colors. They had picnics by cold mountain streams and watched eagles circle overhead. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's stories and dreams and fears. "I want children someday," Thea said one afternoon as they lay in the grass watching clouds drift by. "At least 3, maybe more." Asher's heart clenched at the thought, at the future she was painting for them. "That is a lot of children." "I was an only child until my brother was born," Thea said. "I was lonely. I do not want that for my children." "Our children," Asher said before he could stop himself. Thea rolled onto her side to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "Our children." "If you will have me," Asher said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "I know I am not much of a catch. I am moody and stubborn and I still have nightmares sometimes. But I love you, Thea Morrison. I love you so much it scares me, and I want to build a life with you if you will let me." "You are proposing to me in a field," Thea said, but she was smiling through sudden tears. "I do not have a ring yet," Asher said. "And I probably should have asked your father's permission, except he is gone and I am sorry for that. I am making a mess of this." "You are perfect," Thea said, and she kissed him softly. "And yes, yes, I will marry you, Asher Whitmore. I will have your children and share your life and love you even when you are moody and stubborn." They were married in June of 1876, in the same church where Reverend Marsh had interviewed Thea for the teaching position. The whole town turned out for the wedding, miners in their Sunday best and ranchers with clean shirts, and even Pretty Me wearing a respectable dress for once. Asher stood at the altar in his finest clothes, which were not very fine at all, and watched Thea walk down the aisle in a simple dress the color of cream. His hands shook as he took hers, and he could see that she noticed, could see that she understood. This was not easy for him, standing here in a church with a bride, memories of Sarah bleeding through like watercolors in rain. But Thea squeezed his hands and smiled at him, and Asher realized that he was not betraying Sarah by loving again. He was honoring her by choosing to live. "I love you," he whispered as Reverend Marsh began the ceremony. "I love you too," Thea whispered back. They held the reception at Asher's ranch, which Thea had been slowly transforming into a proper home. There were curtains in the windows now, and flowers in the garden, and all the small touches that made a house feel lived in. They danced in the yard while someone played fiddle, and they cut into a cake that Mrs. Henderson had made, and they laughed with their friends and neighbors until the sun set behind the mountains. That night, alone at last, Asher carried Thea over the threshold of their bedroom and set her down gently. She looked up at him with trust and love and desire, and Asher felt the last of his walls crumble to dust. "Are you still afraid?" Thea asked. "Terrified," Asher admitted, "but in a good way." She laughed and pulled him down to her, and Asher let himself fall. Their first year of marriage was an adjustment. Two independent people learning to share space and decisions and a life. They argued about where to put furniture, and how much firewood they really needed, and whether the chickens Thea wanted to buy were worth the investment. But they also laughed more than Asher had laughed in years, and they built something solid together, a partnership that felt equal and right. Thea continued teaching, though she had to give up the Saturday lessons when she became pregnant in the fall of 1876. The pregnancy was difficult, Wyoming winters being what they were, and Asher spent months terrified that he would lose her the way he had lost Sarah. But Thea was strong and stubborn, and when their son was born in June of 1877, red-faced and screaming with healthy lungs, Asher cried tears of relief and joy. They named him Jacob, after Asher's father who had died when Asher was young. Jacob had his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn chin, and Asher fell in love with him instantly, completely, in a way that was different from his love for Thea but no less profound. "He is perfect," Thea said, exhausted but glowing as she held their son. "You are perfect," Asher said, kissing her forehead. "Thank you." "For what?" "For not giving up on me," Asher said. "For seeing past my walls. For making me break every promise I made to myself." "Those were stupid promises anyway," Thea said, and Asher laughed because she was absolutely right. Their second child, a daughter they named Rose, came 2 years later in the spring of 1879. She was smaller than Jacob had been, more delicate, with blonde hair that reminded Asher painfully of Sarah. The first time he held her, he felt a wave of grief so powerful it nearly knocked him down. But then Rose opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked at him, and Asher felt something shift in his chest. "She looks like her," Thea said quietly, and Asher knew she was talking about Sarah even though they rarely spoke of her. "Yes," Asher said, because there was no point in denying it. Is that hard for you? It was for a moment, Asher admitted. But now I think maybe it is a gift, a way for Sarah to still be part of our family. Thea's eyes filled with tears and she leaned against him, the four of them a unit, a family, something Asher had never thought he would have again. Life settled into a rhythm after that. Asher ran the ranch, breeding horses that were sought after throughout Wyoming. Thea taught school during the year and raised their children with a firm hand and a loving heart. Jacob grew into a serious boy who loved the horses as much as his father did. Rose grew into a wild child who climbed trees and caught snakes and gave her parents constant heart attacks with her fearlessness. In the summer of 1881, Thea announced she was pregnant again, and in the spring of 1882, they welcomed twin boys into the world. Samuel and Daniel, named after the reverend who had married them and Thea's father, were identical in appearance but opposite in temperament. Samuel was quiet and thoughtful, while Daniel was loud and adventurous. Together, they were a force of chaos that kept everyone on their toes. The ranch house had to be expanded to accommodate their growing family. Asher built on 2 more bedrooms and a larger kitchen, working with the same focused intensity he brought to everything he did. Thea planted a bigger garden and bought more chickens, and somehow managed to keep all 4 children fed and clothed and educated. "We said 3 children maybe," Asher said one evening as they surveyed the chaos of bedtime, Daniel refusing to put on his nightshirt while Rose read to Samuel and Jacob tried to sneak a frog into his room. "We said 3 or more," Thea corrected, "and I do not hear you complaining." "I am not complaining," Asher said, pulling her into his arms. "I am just amazed, amazed at this life we have built, amazed at you." "We built it together," Thea said, tilting her face up for a kiss. "The years passed in the way years do when you are happy, quickly and slowly at the same time." Jacob turned 12 and started helping seriously with the horses. Rose turned 10 and announced she wanted to be a veterinarian, which was a scandalous ambition for a girl, but Asher and Thea supported her anyway. The twins turned 7 and finally stopped being quite so identical when Samuel broke his arm falling out of a tree in the winter of 1886. Reverend Marsh died peacefully in his sleep, and the whole town mourned. At the funeral, Asher stood with his wife and children and thought about how much had changed since he had first arrived in South Pass City. He had come here broken and alone, convinced that his life was over. But Thea had arrived and shattered every wall he had built, every promise he had made to himself, and in doing so had given him a life beyond anything he could have imagined. "What are you thinking about?" Thea whispered as they stood in the church cemetery afterward. "About how wrong I was," Asher said. "About everything." "You were not wrong," Thea said. "You were hurt. There is a difference." "I almost let that hurt cost me everything," Asher said, looking at his children who were playing quietly among the headstones, Jacob keeping a careful eye on the younger ones the way he always did. "But you did not," Thea said firmly. "You chose love instead. You chose us. That is what matters." That spring, Jacob came to Asher with an unusual request. "Father, I want to fix up the old church stained glass window, the one that was broken." Asher's heart clenched. The window had been boarded over for years, a constant reminder of that terrible day in Cheyenne. "Why?" "Because Rose asked me about it," Jacob said. "About the lady you were going to marry before Mother, and I think she should be remembered properly, not just as something that was broken." Asher looked at his eldest son, this boy who was becoming a man, and felt a surge of pride so powerful it was almost painful. "That is a good idea," he said, his voice rough. "A very good idea." They commissioned a new stained glass window from an artist in Cheyenne, and when it was installed that summer, the whole congregation gathered to see it. The window depicted a garden at sunrise, flowers blooming in colors that caught the light and threw rainbows across the church pews. At the bottom, in small letters, it read, "In memory of Sarah Jenkins, who lived with Grace and died too soon." She would have liked this, Thea said, standing beside Asher as they looked at the window. There was no jealousy in her voice, only understanding. "She would have liked you," Asher said. "She always wanted me to be happy." "Are you?" Thea asked. "Happy." Asher pulled her close, watching their 4 children examining the window with interest and reverence. He thought about the ranch that had grown from a lonely bachelor's dwelling to a bustling family home. He thought about the horses in his pastures and the garden Thea tended, and the Saturday dinners where their table was always full of laughter and food. He thought about the nights he fell asleep beside his wife and woke up knowing he was loved. He thought about how close he had come to refusing all of this, to hiding behind his grief and his walls forever. "Yes," he said, "I am happy, more than I ever thought possible." The years continued to unfold in their beautiful, ordinary way. Jacob fell in love with a rancher's daughter named Elizabeth and married her when he turned 20. They built a house on the eastern edge of Asher and Thea's property and started their own horse breeding operation. Rose defied convention and went to veterinary school in Chicago, writing letters home that were full of determination and homesickness in equal measure. The twins grew into strong young men, Samuel becoming a teacher like his mother and Daniel following his father into ranching. In the spring of 1895, Asher and Thea became grandparents for the first time when Jacob and Elizabeth welcomed a baby girl they named Thea, after her grandmother. Asher held his granddaughter in his arms and marveled at how life had come full circle, how love had multiplied and expanded beyond anything he could have predicted. "You are crying," Thea said, putting her arm around him as they stood in Jacob's house looking at the sleeping infant. "I am just grateful," Asher said, "for all of this, for you for refusing to let me hide, for pushing past all my defenses and making me love again." "You made it easy," Thea said. "Once you stopped fighting it." "I broke every promise I made," Asher said. "I swore I would never love again, never risk the pain. And then you arrived and I broke every single one of those promises." "Good," Thea said firmly. "They were terrible promises." Asher laughed and kissed her. This woman who had saved him without even trying, who had seen a broken man and decided he was worth fighting for. They had been married for 19 years now, and he loved her more than he had on their wedding day, more than he had thought possible to love another person. They walked home through the spring evening, past the pastures where horses grazed peacefully, past the garden where early flowers were beginning to bloom, past the house they had built together through love and stubbornness and faith. Their other children would be visiting tomorrow for Sunday dinner, a tradition that had evolved naturally over the years. The house would be full of noise and laughter and life, exactly the way Asher liked it now. "You ever think about how things might have been different?" Thea asked as they sat on their porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. "If I had not had that stagecoach trouble, if you had not ridden out to help all the time," Asher admitted. "And it terrifies me, thinking how close I came to missing all of this." "But you did not miss it," Thea said. "That is the point. You could have turned away, you could have sent me to the relay station or into town without getting involved. But you chose to help. You chose to open your door and eventually your heart. That was all you, Asher." "It was you too," Asher said. "Your stubbornness, your refusal to let me hide, your insistence that I was worth saving." "We saved each other," Thea said simply. "That is how love works." Asher pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the solid warmth of her against his side. Somewhere inside, he could hear the sounds of their life continuing. the clock ticking on the mantel, the dog scratching at the door to be let in, the familiar creaks and settling of a house well lived in. This was everything he had sworn he did not want, everything he had promised himself he would never risk again. And it was everything. Rose came home from Chicago that summer with her veterinary degree and a quiet determination to prove herself in a field dominated by men. She set up practice in South Pass City, treating everything from ranch horses to family dogs, and slowly won over the skeptics with her skill and dedication. Asher could not have been more proud if she had become president. The twins, now in their early 20s, were courting sisters from a neighboring ranch, much to everyone's amusement. Samuel had taken over teaching from his mother when Thea finally retired, and Daniel had expanded their horse operation to include cattle. The ranch that Asher had started alone and bitter was now a thriving family business, a legacy he was building with his children and would pass down to his grandchildren. In the fall of 1897, Jacob and Elizabeth announced they were expecting their second child. The twins both married their sweethearts in a double wedding that was the social event of the season. Rose started courting a young veterinarian who had come to South Pass City specifically to work with her, drawn by her reputation. Life was full and rich, and sometimes overwhelming in its abundance. "We did good," Asher said to Thea one evening as they sat in their usual spot on the porch. They were both in their 50s now, showing gray in their hair and lines around their eyes, but Asher thought Thea had never been more beautiful. "We did," Thea agreed, "though it was not always easy." "Nothing worth having is," Asher said. "Wise words from the man who once swore he would never love again," Thea teased. "That man was an idiot," Asher said. "Thank God you did not listen to him." "Thank God you did not listen to him either," Thea said. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out one by one over the mountains. Asher thought about the long road that had brought him here, from the grief and guilt in Cheyenne to the joy and fulfillment of this moment. He thought about Sarah, who he still remembered fondly but no longer with the crushing pain of those first years. He thought about the stagecoach breaking down at just the right place, at just the right time, bringing Thea into his life when he needed her most. "I love you," he said, because he could never say it enough. "I love you too," Thea said, leaning her head on his shoulder, "forever and always." And Asher believed her, because they had already proven that love was stronger than grief, stronger than fear, stronger than all the promises a broken heart could make. They had built a life together from the wreckage of their pasts, and it was beautiful. The Wyoming night settled around them, cold and clear and full of stars, and Asher Whitmore was happy. Not despite the pain he had suffered, but because of it, because it had led him here, to this porch, to this woman, to this life. He had broken every promise he had made to himself, and in doing so, he had found everything he never knew he needed.